In November of 1993, a man ventured deep into the Himalayas on what was intended to be a simple 10-day trek. But when those 10 days passed, the man had vanished without a trace. What he would go on to experience in the following weeks would become one of the most harrowing survival stories ever recorded in the region. This is his chilling tale. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In October of 1992, British medical intern Daniel Carter sat down to compose a letter. Once he was finished, he carefully folded it, sealed it inside an envelope, and sent it off to its destination, Kathmandu, Nepal. Nepal, at the time, was still considered a developing country, with limited access to modern medical facilities, but that was precisely why Daniel chose it. He was eager to complete his elective medical training in a place where his skills could be of real use. Weeks passed without a response, and as months dragged on, Daniel started losing hope. But he was not one to give up so easily. Determined to fulfill his dream, Daniel took matters into his own hands. Nearly a year later, with or without an official invitation, he purchased a one-way ticket to Nepal. Joining him on the journey was his longtime friend and fellow adventurer, Mark Sullivan. But as fate would have it, mere days before his departure, a letter from Nepal finally arrived. The hospital in Kathmandu welcomed him with open arms, granting him permission to begin his elective residency in January of 1994. The news was exhilarating. At 24 years old, Daniel felt like he was on top of the world. He was about to graduate from one of the UK's top medical schools. He had a supportive family back home, and he had just proposed to his girlfriend, who eagerly awaited his return. Everything seemed to be falling into place. Despite his studious nature, Daniel was no stranger to adventure. He was an avid runner, regularly pushing himself through grueling marathons, and he had a passion for long-distance cycling. But his true love was mountaineering, a hobby he had picked up during his university years. Having conquered several peaks in Scotland and the Alps, he felt well prepared for the challenges of the Himalayas. After arriving in Nepal in early October, Daniel and Mark spent weeks exploring the culture and immersing themselves in the local community. He then visited the hospital a handful of times and met the doctors and nurses he'd soon be working alongside, and they got to know him a bit too. When some of them learned about his passion for staying active, they recommended that he use his downtime before his elective period to begin trekking the nearby Himalayas. For an avid hiker like Daniel, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. The Himalayas obviously aren't just any mountain range, and Kathmandu is like the epicenter of activity as one of the closest settlements to Mount Everest. Interestingly though, while Daniel enjoyed hiking, he wasn't much of a climber. In fact, he was terrified of heights, so climbing a peak like Everest was out of the question. But luckily, the Himalayas offer a variety of terrain that was much more suitable for him. After getting settled in Kathmandu, Daniel and Mark immediately started planning a hike up the Jamsam Trail, a popular trekking route that takes more than a week to complete, and runs through forests, rocky landscapes, and some of the deepest gorges in the world. Since this was more than just a leisurely day hike, they wanted to make sure they were well prepared. The Himalayan winter was fast approaching, so they set about securing supplies and hiring 2 porters to help carry their gear and a guide to lead them. When the day finally came to set out, Daniel and Mark quickly found it to be an enjoyable trek. As the days passed, they reached as high as 9,800 feet, 3,000 meters, and were treated to some of the most spectacular views anywhere on Earth. The weather was cold, considering the high altitudes, but it wasn't anywhere near as bad as they were prepared for. As they continued on, they even ran into some trekkers who were just wearing ski jackets and sneakers. Soon, Daniel and Mark felt a bit ridiculous for being so over-prepared. A few days into the hike, they decided to let the guide and porters return to Kathmandu with much of the gear they had brought with them, while they continued on with just what they had in their backpacks. A few days after that, they arrived back in Kathmandu, riding the high of completing a successful trek through the Himalayas. The trip went so well, in fact, that they immediately began planning another one, before Daniel started his elective period at the Kathmandu hospital. After having a taste of the Himalayas, they figured they'd be able to prepare with a little more knowledge of what to expect. The problem with that assumption, however, was that their next trek would begin in late December, a much different beast than a Himalayan September. their preparation for the Jomsom Trail would have been much more appropriate for their next planned trek. But the ease with which they completed the Jomsom Trail gave them a false sense of security. This time they planned to take the Halambu Trail, a much more challenging route, but one with lodges along the way, giving trekkers a chance to eat and rest. When December rolled around and they made their final preparations for the trip, they did so with minimal gear, just enough to fit in their rucksacks. Daniel also brought 10 pairs of underwear, a handful of t-shirts, a pair of thermal underwear, several pairs of pants, one sweatshirt, and a light jacket. Additionally, he packed a towel, his camera, and 4 different books to read during nights in the lodges. On December 21st, they got their trek started and made it to the first lodge, where they met a few German hikers who were on their way back along the Halambu Trail. According to the Germans, the trek wasn't that difficult, but there also wasn't much in terms of payoff and things to see, so Daniel and Mark started to have second thoughts about their plans. Daniel then pulled out a map of Nepal that he had, and as was often the case in developing countries, it was old and outdated, but he could at least see some of the other trail options if they wanted to change course. After looking at the map Daniel was reviewing, the Germans pulled out a much better and newer map and allowed Daniel and Mark to keep it. The pair then set their sights on the Gosain Kun Trail, which was an offshoot of the Halambu Trail that wasn't marked on the old map. So the next morning they got an early start, and along the way, they caught up with a man named Matthew Fulton who was trekking solo. In a small world scenario, Daniel and Mark immediately recognized Matthew's accent as British, and the three made fast friends. As it turned out, Matthew was also planning to take the Halambu Trail, but Daniel and Mark were quick to convince him that it wasn't worth it, based on what they had heard from the German trekkers. One of them then suggested they take the Gosain Kun Trail together, and it was settled. The 3 men then continued along the Halambu Trail toward the intersection that would lead them to their new route. Along the way, though, Mark suffered a leg injury, forcing him to turn back. Daniel offered to return with him, but Mark insisted he continue. They made plans to reunite in Kathmandu, and Daniel and Matthew pressed on. So around 7:30 a.m., Daniel and Matthew departed the lodge and spent about the first hour and a half on a pristine trail, taking in the breathtaking sights of the mountains all around them. As the morning wore on, though, conditions changed rapidly. The temperature fell noticeably, and more dark clouds rolled in. Soon, it also started to snow, but it wasn't anything like what must have fallen overnight. Instead, these were large flakes that severely limited visibility and started to accumulate beneath their feet faster than the 2 men expected. Before long, the storm had dumped 5 inches of snow onto the ground, and the once clearly visible trail was now buried. This caused Daniel to become concerned as they continued on, and he wondered if maybe they should turn back. Before he could say anything, though, he and Matthew somehow ended up on the opposite sides of a creek, and they could no longer see one another. It would take them 15 minutes of shouting back and forth before they were able to reunite, and Daniel immediately voiced his fears about the conditions to Matthew. Matthew, however, was unconcerned and convinced that he could find the path that would lead them back to Kathmandu. Daniel wasn't so sure, and in a move that disappointed Matthew, decided his best course of action was to retrace their steps to the lodge where they spent the previous night. Matthew, on the other hand, decided that he was going to continue on, so after a brief conversation, they went in opposite directions. As Daniel started on his journey back the way he came, he did his best to follow the footprints, but the snow was falling so hard that they were filled in more and more the further he went. And before long, he had no idea where he was. There were very few landmarks, if any, to mark the trail, and the snow was falling so hard that it was impossible to see more than 30 feet ahead. This meant that Daniel had to face the fact that he was now lost. So next, figuring that the creek nearby must lead to some semblance of civilization, he started to follow it, and in checking his old map, he saw that it ran right to the town of Talu. After 4 more hours of walking, he noticed that the valley he was once in had significantly narrowed, and the high rock walls were rapidly closing in on him. As far as he could see ahead of him at this point, he saw that several creeks came together to form a small river, so he continued on. After a short walk, though, he saw that the river had come to a complete end, as the rock walls alongside him were now closer than at any point previously. It was a waterfall. But still hoping that he could somehow find a way down it, Daniel crept closer to the edge of it and looked down, and immediately he knew he was in trouble. He estimated its height at around 100 feet, or 30 meters, and he was suddenly without many choices. Going down was out of the question, and going back was no guarantee either. This left going up as the only other option. Again, Daniel wasn't a climber, but he figured if he'd get high enough, he might be able to get above the clouds and wait out the weather. Daniel figured that the rock wall was about as tall as the waterfall, and so over the course of the next 2 hours, he went from ledge to slippery ledge, as he somehow made his way to the very top. There were times when he was only hanging on by his fingers. When he was finished, he crested over the cliff and collapsed into exhaustion. But as dangerous a decision as it was to climb, Daniel did find a rocky overhang that gave him some shelter at the top of the cliff. While he regathered some of his strength, he recalled a few lessons from medical school on hypothermia, and just how dangerous a condition it can be. So it may seem counterintuitive, but as he settled in under the overhang, he stripped down, pulled out his towel, and made sure to dry every part of his body. He had just spent hours cold and wet, and his clothes were soaked, and he figured it was a lot safer being cold and dry instead. Once he was finished, that night, he camped under this rocky ledge with his sleeping bag pulled over his head. In the morning, Daniel got an early start in his desperate attempt to trek out of his current situation. He then located a different creek that he started to follow, but the snow was so deep that the going was extremely slow. After 2 hours, he had walked just a single kilometer. The banks of the gully he was walking in on this day weren't nearly as high as the ones he encountered the day before, but they were instead extremely slick with ice and snow. So anytime he felt like his best move would be to climb again, he'd only get so far up before falling back down to the gully floor. By 4 p.m., he had enough, and fortunately, found another overhang to camp under. Just like before, he took off his clothes and dried himself the best he could, and noticed that his feet were completely numb. He then dressed in a set of dry clothing and laid down for the night, shivering much worse than he was the previous night. In fact, at one point, he was certain there was no way he'd make it through the night. He even got up and reached into his backpack for a pen and a notebook and started writing a letter to his family. The guilt he felt for getting himself into this situation was overwhelming, and he couldn't apologize enough for the heartbreak this would cause them. When the letter was finished, he closed his notebook, stored it away, and laid back down, waiting for the end. On December 29th, so 5 days after Daniel was supposed to meet Mark for dinner in Kathmandu, the phone rang at the London home of his older sister, Olivia Carter. Her husband answered the call, and before long, he came downstairs to talk to her. Mark had sent a fax message to Daniel's parents, informing them that Daniel was missing. The news obviously rocked Olivia, and she found herself panicked, not sure what to do with this information. Her first thought was that she needed to jump on a plane immediately from Nepal. But by this time, the British Foreign Affairs Department had caught wind of Daniel being missing and urged Olivia to stay put. Instead, they recommended reaching out to a mountaineering expert named Carl Harrison, who lived in Kathmandu, to lead a search for her brother. The next day, Carl and the first search party headed out as Daniel's family waited anxiously. They waited for the phone to ring with the news that Daniel had just been snowed in at one of the trail's lodges, but as the days passed, that call never came. Joanne reached back out to the Foreign Affairs Department for updates frequently, and on January 2nd, 1994, there was finally something. They told her that the search party received a report of a sighting of a solo trekker from some French-Canadian trekkers, and they were 99% sure it was Daniel. This was a huge relief to Olivia as she called her parents and told them about the good news, but sitting around and waiting for information was becoming too much for her to bear. The next day, she went and got a travel visa for Nepal, and on January 7th, she boarded a flight bound for South Asia. By the time she arrived in Kathmandu, Daniel had been missing for 16 days. On many occasions, Daniel tried trekking out of the Himalayas, only to be turned back to his lonely rock overhang by the depth of the snow or the intensity of the snowstorms that continued to roll through. Having brought only 2 chocolate bars that were now long gone, he had no choice but to eat snow to survive. And before long, it became clear that walking out of there wasn't going to be an option. And when it came down to it, he knew that his best chance of surviving the ordeal came down to being spotted by a helicopter or waiting until the snow had thawed enough in the spring, which was still months away. From that point onward, the rocky overhang became his new home. He had no food, no fire, and nothing but the clothes on his back and a sleeping bag to keep him warm. So he did the only thing he could do: sleep and read. Obviously, though, little could distract him from the raging hunger he felt. He thought about food when he was awake and dreamt about it when he slept. But after the first 2 weeks or so with nothing but snow to eat, the hunger eventually dissipated as he leaned on the discipline he learned as a martial artist. Almost like he was meditating, he'd do his best to think about particular movements, techniques, and sequences, consuming his mind with every tiny detail. Soon, about the only thing that could break that train of thought was the condition of his feet. He hadn't been able to feel them for some time, and it didn't matter what he did to try to warm them up. Nothing worked. Then one day he removed his shoes and socks and saw that his feet were completely blue. He then reached into the medical kit and pulled out a pair of dissection scissors. Then he jabbed them into the side of his foot. The wound quickly bled, but Daniel felt absolutely no pain. He was now terrified that if he did survive the ordeal, he'd lose his feet. But as if this wasn't enough to worry about, he was suddenly reminded one day that he was not at the top of the food chain in the Himalayas. Daniel was awoken one afternoon by horrifying animal screams. He then ripped the sleeping bag over his head and jumped up, looking over the rocky ledge that sloped above him. About 100 feet, or 30 meters away, he saw a bush that was violently shaking, but he couldn't immediately make out what was causing it until a large black figure moved into the clearing. It was a Himalayan black bear, and now Daniel was in its sights. Daniel then grabbed the dissection scissors and held them tightly in his hand as he shouted at the bear to come down the slope to him. This was a moment of insanity on Daniel's part, as the only thing he thought was that the bear could give him a quick end. But instead of coming toward him, the bear got spooked and darted up the slope and out of sight. But either way, for the next 5 nights, he heard the bear near his overhang and waited to be attacked. Meanwhile, as Daniel was fighting for his life, the rescue effort was hitting problem after problem. Several different rescue teams entered the Himalayas and were turned back by the terrain, conditions, or weather. And some even got lost themselves. Now, in Nepal as well, Olivia was much closer to the search for her brother. But she still felt helpless to do anything, so she did only what she could. She then sought out the French-Canadian trekkers that had apparently seen Daniel, and when she met with them, most of the group were certain that it was her brother they spotted. One of the women in the group, however, wasn't so sure. She remembered talking to a solo trekker from Germany in the days before the sighting, and thought she recognized him as the man mistaken for Daniel. And sure enough, search leaders received a letter from a German man who said he was trekking alone on the Halambu Trail. This all but crushed Olivia's hopes that her brother was still alive somewhere. By then, Daniel had been lost for 21 days, and Olivia was growing more and more desperate. She suddenly recalled a conversation she had with a local woman when she arrived at the Kathmandu airport. The two women spoke about Daniel's situation, and Olivia asked her what she'd recommend. And in response, the local woman said she'd go to consult a Buddhist Lama, which is a spiritual leader. To a British citizen, this came off as an odd suggestion, but the local woman assured Olivia that lamas could see what others can't. To that point, Olivia hadn't given the suggestion much consideration at all. But as things became more desperate, she figured it couldn't hurt to do as the local woman recommended. Olivia then scheduled a time with a Buddhist Lama and explained the situation to him, showing him a map of the region where Daniel was believed to be lost. After hearing Olivia out, the Lama prayed on it for a few seconds and then looked down at the map. He then dropped his finger on a specific area, a triangle formed by the towns of Fidi, Gopti, and Talu, and told her that the searchers should look there. The area the Lama pointed to, however, was an unlikely place for Daniel to end up. For one thing, mountain experts doubted there was even a route that would lead them to where the Lama pointed, but he insisted that this is where they'd find Daniel. Before she left, she asked the Lama if they'd find Daniel alive, to which he replied that she would meet her brother again. At the same time, though, arguably, the more practical approach to the search was still underway, which included tracking down Matthew. Rescuers still hadn't been able to find him either, and there was some concern that he might be lost in the mountains too. Through Tim, it was known that Matthew had a flight to Thailand after Christmas, and he was scheduled to arrive back in the UK sometime before January 21st. A message was then left for Matthew at the airport by the British Embassy, and on January 15th, he called Olivia. Matthew had made it out of the Himalayas by following another path he had located, which led him to a local village. He then explained to her that he and Daniel separated somewhere between Fidi and Gopte, which was a striking revelation. This meant Daniel had turned back to the southwest, which was not an area where rescuers were looking for him. If he continued on that path, it would put him right in the middle of the triangle the llama had pointed out on the map. After 30 days stranded in the Himalayas, Daniel finally heard the first signs of any attempt to find him. There was a distinct chopping sound in the distance, which he initially wrote off as the wind, but as it drew closer, it became clear that it was the sound of a helicopter. He then rushed out of his sleeping bag before grabbing it and trudging into a clearing. He then waved the sleeping bag over his head after he dropped his pants to reveal his bright red long johns, which he hoped would make it easier to spot him. He estimated that the chopper was about 6 miles, or 10 kilometers away from him, and he watched it circle for a few moments before it eventually turned back and disappeared into the distance. This was one of the most disheartening moments of his time in the Himalayas to that point. By this time, Daniel looked like a shell of himself, and his once muscular body was now more than a skinny skeleton. He also had little strength and felt ill, and he developed mouth ulcers and a bad throat infection. All in all, he was completely miserable and hopeless. This was when he was seriously considering ending things, but the only thing keeping him from going through with it was the realization that his body would one day be found, and his family would learn just how much he suffered before death. So, despite the slim chance of surviving or being rescued, Daniel did his best to carry on. On his 42nd day in the Himalayas, he once again heard the sound of a helicopter drawing close to him. With every ounce of strength he had remaining, he pulled himself out of his sleeping bag and once again waved it in the air. For 20 minutes, the helicopter circled Daniel, who waved until he completely collapsed in the snow from exhaustion. Moments later, the chopper darted down the valley and disappeared. This time, though, Daniel knew he had been seen, but he also knew that it would take up to 4 days for them to reach him by foot. By then, he was sure he'd be dead. Back at the rescue headquarters, Olivia sat by the radio like she had every day to that point, waiting for any information from searchers in the mountains. The radio then suddenly crackled, and a voice came over saying they had found Daniel, and that he was alive. The rescuer made sure to repeat the message twice, knowing that it was such an improbable development that it might not be believed unless it was said multiple times. In that moment, Olivia was so overcome that she couldn't even respond to the message. Sometime later, when the helicopter returned, Carl and a team of rescuers set out on foot. Under the rock ledge high above the mountain valleys, Daniel lay in a sleeping bag, listening to only the sounds of silence and wind that he had heard for more than 40 days. Suddenly, a third sound interrupted the other two, as he swore he heard voices in the distance. To Daniel, this was it. He had reached the point of hypothermia, where he was starting to hallucinate, and he was sure death would soon follow. But then, the voices came closer. So next, taking a deep breath just to be sure, Daniel whistled loudly through his teeth, not expecting any response. As he waited in silence, though, a whistle returned, and upon hearing this, Daniel sat up in his sleeping bag and shouted. As he looked out from beneath his rock overhang, he heard the crunching of boots and soon saw 2 men who crouched down to look beneath the ledge. One of them then asked if he was Daniel Carter from the UK, and Daniel said yes. The 2 men then leapt beneath the overhang and started hugging and patting him on the back. The rescuers had been so invested in finding him that they were overjoyed. One of them then looked at Daniel and said that he was a miracle. When Daniel asked why he said that, the rescuer told Daniel that no one had ever lived in this part of the Himalayas for more than 10 days. Daniel, however, had survived 43. The next morning, a helicopter flew in, and Daniel was attached to a harness and pulled aboard. Back at the landing pad, Olivia anxiously awaited the arrival of her brother, and when the helicopter landed, several rescuers exited first and helped Daniel out. He immediately started walking toward Olivia as she ran to him, and the two embraced for what felt like an eternity. She hardly even recognized him, He was dangerously thin, dirty, and bearded, and this would be the last time Daniel would walk for some time as he was taken to the hospital. But he would eventually make a full recovery. The spot where Daniel was found was exactly where the Lama said he would be.